Thank you so much, Tom. What a phenomenal panel. It has raised really crucial examples of how we disrupt humanitarian narratives around accountability, activism. I was going to say agency, but feedback. I'm going to ask one question and then I would love to open it up to the floor. We have 15 minutes, so I thought I'd take questions in round of 3 questions. My question is simply, how do we further disrupt the humanitarian narrative and how do we transform global hierarchies? So what are the next things we need to do?
Further disrupt and transform. It's a big question, but the ideal scenario would be for me not to be here doing this kind of work, for my colleagues in the Syrian and Greek Youth Forum to be saying these things. But by placing their knowledge at the centre of everything, by calling them the experts rather than invoking other people's expertise on refugee matters, people who are living through this are the experts. So by listening, sometimes you have to talk as well, but by listening, taking very seriously the ways of knowing, the experiences, the forms of activism that exist within communities, and the way that they expand into new communities, diverse communities within spaces of protracted displacement, must be at the centre of these things.
Again, just to continue disrupting rather than reproducing, so one has to identify what those tropes are, I think, and then to be able to identify the ways in which they have always already been resisted and trace the histories of disruption which predate us by far, and to recognise that the conversations, unfortunately, that we're having today are conversations that have been had before. So to identify what the structures are that prevent those disruptions from moving forwards, to identify the ways that these ideas, voices, modes of expertise have previously been blocked, and it's only through challenging and resisting those structures that meaningful disruption can be embodied.
So starting the first 3, one, and then Professor Barbara, and well, so we'll just take those 3 first, and then have some feedback, and then we'll go to the next round.
Thank you so much for this very enlightening and moving panel. Thank you so much. My question to Elena. Elena, if we think hospitality as a value, which has a value in, if we commodify it, I think the state played a major role in the exchange rate of this value, hospitality as a value. And then, if you agree with me on this, well, we have in Denmark, for instance, hospitality, you go to prison if you host illegal. You have another model, Canadian model, where hospitality sponsorship program become like praising the family who receive, but also enabling the whole regime of receiving for Canada. So can you you thought about this connection between state and hospitality?
Thank you, all of you, including our virtual participant, Dima. So just 3 little issues. Lena, one of the things that attracts me to your writing and your project is the exploration of ambivalence. And somehow I'm wondering whether a kind of good refugee, one that I agree with, is not being reconstituted in the discourse of hosting. That may only be because of this presentation, because I feel so that, just as we have the good victim or the worthy refugee, we could also produce ethically the good refugee, the one who hosts, as opposed to the one who doesn't host. And there were a few voices like that, but they were all about material restraint, not more about an ethics. But maybe we need to think about, you know, I'm a little always, I always like the kind of naughty end of things a little bit, you know. And maybe we need to think about somebody who resists. So now, not that I'm saying that that's the better way to go. Of course, it's better to host or not, but I just wanted to mention that. The other thing I want to mention very quickly is the overuse in our, and I don't do it now, but the overuse of precarity. I'm wondering whether precarity now isn't becoming, or hasn't become, a term which rather like resistance had once become, you know, that somehow we all think we know what it is. And there are a million different ways of being vulnerable, precarious, anxious. I mean, there could be all kinds of affect. So I think that was my other issue. I was rather struck in Dima's presentation how there was a kind of a heroic narrative of resistance, which was all about mothers saying to their sons, "You will become like your fathers." Now, maybe this is I think one should be, you know, both politically and ethnographically sensitive. I mean, maybe this is exactly the way. I've certainly heard that notion of martyrship always goes from son to son. But what's happening to the women? You know, and I think that's to me is a very significant issue. And finally, Tom, you know, it was very moving, but I didn't get any disruptive sense. I thought these songs and these chants, which bourgeois citizens in all kinds of ways, radical ways, I mean, I'm not using bourgeois pejoratively, have taken to the streets and chanted. But there seemed to me to be such a desire to always be an activist and not a refugee. Whereas the tension is that one is displaced in the process of being re-emplaced. And the tension is to me what is really important. That is what I found in the poem. The refugee is a dialectical process. It's a charismatic process. If you don't have that exclusion, then the agency itself has nothing to reflect itself against. So it just seemed to me, these are just a comment, that it just seemed to me these are rousing songs. But I didn't find them disruptive. I just found them as part of a whole tradition, 200-year-old tradition of people, citizens taking to the streets to protest. A very good thing. But the specificity, the disturbing specificity, I was listening out for. Anyway, thanks a lot. And I hope you take these comments as really being engaged with this very fine panel. Thank you.
And then one more for this round.
Maybe that was a sign. I just want to thank you. It was incredibly powerful and a lot to process and think about. I'll just speak quickly. You're talking about structures, and I want to speak on behalf of the little international agencies who are kind of in that little line. That's unfortunately been most of my career has been in that world, and so I'm trying to separate and process this. I think we spend a lot of our time as international actors heartbroken. Now I'll just say there's some really, really bad stuff happening as well in aid programming, no question. But you spend a lot of your time knowing that you're, like I just spent time recently in Lebanon, where, you know, with Islamic Relief, listening to the local staff about their programs, they're not allowed to help the Palestinians. It's the, I mean, obviously I'm going to demonize the next level up, and they'll go next level. When you go to this scale and you've got US government funding, you've got DFID, you are prohibited from doing what you know is right. You're prohibited from integration. You get grants for a year at a time. How can you do sustainable programs? So the local staff there, their heart is broken. And you sit there and hear their stories. And just one other example, you know, I was in Sri Lanka after the tsunami. You could only help the people hit by the wave. Across the street, you have people protracted from conflict for 10 years. And so I just want to say there's humans in all of the levels, and there's some really bad stuff. And I think this language really helps me as well to make sure I'm framing it differently. But practically, practical next steps desperately needs to happen at the level that decides politics, because basically we're at the end of the politic scale. So just thank you. I heard you and I'm listening, but I just coming at you a bit heartbroken myself. So anyway.
Thank you. So we have a number of questions. Elena, what is the exchange rate of hospitality when hosting is criminalised, etc.? We have from Professor Baba, what is the exploration of ambivalence and resistance and the overuse of precarity and problems around heroic narratives?
Thank you. Sally, I think we should continue that conversation over lunch. I don't have a quick response, other than feeling deeply concerned around the commodification of any response in this context. I think that it can be strategically used by different actors in ways that are very problematic, as you've already highlighted. But to explore the potentialities of that, I think that we could have a conversation over lunch, if that's okay. Just also attentive to time and making sure that I give time for Tom to answer the question. Professor Baba, I've written extensively about non-response and about the that's the kind of one element of it. People do not care, do not respond, but that is still a response in and of itself, and that's part of the ambivalence and the ambiguity that arises in these situations, which are characterised by individual, communal, but also spatial responses on different fronts. So I think that what I presented today was just one quite social science, this is what our interviewees are saying, to highlight the extent to which the refugee host positionality, modes of response, etc., intersect and are mutually constitutive. So that was just one very short extract. But what the research is exploring is precisely those multiple levels of response and non-response, observing, hosting, not hosting, what this means when we pull it all together and view it in a broader structural context. And what we're not trying to do is idealise local level responses, but situate it within that multi-scalar framework, which does absolutely not aim to demonise the civil society organisation or the NGO, or even the big INGO, etc., or even the UN system. You can demonize them. Because you're absolutely right, it is nested within these broader structures of capitalism, neoliberalism, that those structures of inequality and oppression and exploitation and marginalisation, which creates and constitutes these modes of, we could call it precarity or violence. These are the structures of violence. So it's not to target one level, but to say we need to actually address those multiple structures. And if we do want to disrupt the humanitarian narrative, we also need to ask those difficult questions about when is non-response the ethical response, which we see Ms. Asper-Fortier engaging with consistently. At what stage does one have to say, no, we will not respond on these terms? And at what stage is it the ethical thing to step back and reflect, and non-response being more ethical potentially than response, which is complicit in the continuing violence against different people. So I think that hopefully also partially touches on that notion of precarity. Of course, it's a vocabulary which I was using in terms of an accessible presentation, etc. But these are all concepts, constructs which we are engaging with critically throughout the project, and which we will hopefully be able to write about in more detail moving forwards. So I'll step and move over to Tom.
Tom, is it truly disruptive?
It's a very good question, thank you. And my friends who've written this song are watching this right now on the live stream, so I really do wish they were here to answer this question instead of me. But I would say, perhaps, by playing it in this context, in a university in the centre of London, loses some of the power of performance context, which is so important in this case. So the song itself, I mean, the lyrics do interesting work in that my Syrian friends claim themselves as the humanitarians, for one thing, and address Greece directly and use language in interesting ways. But it's the way in which the song fills space in the city, which is when it becomes, I would say, much more disruptive in terms that you lay out. And I mean, if we just think back to Dima's presentation, the videos that she showed were full of song. Okay, enormous loudspeaker systems set up in public squares across cities. This is a defining feature of uprisings and protests. And you're right, it's not new. It's been around for a long time, but it continues to be resonant and important. And in Athens, it meets with an equal history, a parallel history of people doing exactly the same thing, of stringing loudspeakers up in trees or mounting them on lampposts in public squares to resist other kinds of struggle, or to produce other kinds of struggle. And so when you get these two things sat on top of each other, amplified sound, loudspeakers have a lot of agency themselves in these situations. And by claiming that sonic space and remaking the city in the terms that I'm thinking about here, that's when the disruption comes in. Much more than just a text written on a screen for you to read.
Tom, I just want to, I know that I should, but I just want to say this. Gramsci has a wonderful, talking about sonic space, a wonderful image where he says, what hegemony does is only turn up the volume. Not that the other voices are not there, it just turns up the volume and keeps turning up the volume.
And can I, in fact, just simply continue from what Professor Baba has just uttered with regards to Gramsci and the general. In fact, the very foundation of this song, I don't know if you know about this song, is based, I'm sure that those who speak Arabic or are familiar with Ghawar al-Toshi. So we're talking about, in fact, a song, I'm talking about the tunes that is sung in prison. And this is important, in fact, to foreground and to situate. This is something that, and how these tunes travel across time and the space, and then used and reused, and at times perhaps, I think, injected with a new different legal statuses and imaginations.
Okay, so do you want to respond?
I want to respond. Just to say, thank you. And the movement of music and melody is super important as well in this disrupting citizenship, non-citizenship boundaries. So I was learning Greek and Greek music for a long time before I was invited to join this activist collective. The first thing I had to do when I joined this group was learn how to play Jana Jana on guitar. But what you find is the same melodies circulating all around the Eastern Mediterranean. So you can play a song and exchange verses in Greek and Arabic, no problem. And it becomes a different song altogether. And when you're playing that on the street, it does something very interesting. So, yeah, thank you.
So very briefly, we're just going to do one more round. Three, take three rounds.
So my name is Rana Dajani. I'm actually the professor that Dima talked about in her video. I have three quick comments, questions. One is that I think even as we speak here as a panel and as participants, we think that we are being objective, neutral, and that we're trying not to take perspectives and sides, yet we fall into the trap of that the blind spot that we don't know about. And here I'm talking about calling out of Turkey attacking Syria, when Russia actually is attacking Idlib today, and we don't talk about it. When the US is complicit in other things, or the UK and everything. So we need to call out everybody, not some and not others. And this just speaks to how we can fall into the trap of being blind, how the issue is very complex, and how we have to be very careful. And to call out everybody, not to follow the media who calls out who they want for particular power dynamics. And I think this is very important. The second point, which was brought up by you, Professor Roba, about why did Dima talk about the woman. So we conducted these interviews, which is another research project apart from Elena's project. And actually the women do talk about them wanting to go back into Syria to follow up with activism and being revolutionary as soon as they make sure that their children are being taken care of someone else. Because in the context of the family structure, it is the mother, the female, who's taking care of the family. In the absence of the man who, in the tradition and the culture of Syria and the Middle East, is that they are the men are going out to do the work and the women are taking care of the children. And just to call out that we need to also focus on the female who is left after the war and the martyrs and the activism with nobody to help them take care of the family, where their husbands are imprisoned or killed or disappear and never come back. So recently, last week, there was a big conference in Istanbul on the family structure, focusing on the female by a Lebanese NGO called Ghiras, which was amazing, and I asked you to follow up with them. My last comment is that we talk about hosting and refugees among different cultures and contexts within the Middle East, Syria, Palestine specifically. And because we're talking about Syria, the majority of the Syrians are Muslim. And taking care of and hospitality is part of the Muslim life, not as a religion per se, as you look at Christianity in the West, but as a way of life in the Muslim context. So you don't have to be religious to be a Muslim who cares about your neighbor and who cares about your family and the stranger for 3 days. This is part of our culture as Arabs, as Muslim, taking care of their guests for 3 days. So I think we need to talk. I know there's a workshop tomorrow about it, but this is something central that should be called out. Even in the song, it's about God, or the quotes. So it's part of who we are. And we need to talk about it because it is a very important and essential ingredient. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentations. I just wanted to ask Elena quickly if you could share some reflections on your fieldwork in Jordan and how there were similarities but perhaps differences to the host refugee dimension. Because there are Palestinian refugees in Jordan, but the majority of them have the citizenship. So how does that affect this host refugee from the work that you did? Thanks very much. I absolutely loved the panel, and it's a real intellectual feast this morning so far. But I found myself thinking with disrupting humanitarian narratives about the direction of travel. Are we travelling towards disruption because we're travelling towards an understanding of a common good? Is there a kind of teleological transcendent idea here? Or are we travelling towards disruption because there is a sense of disruption as an anarchic necessity? And within that, I know my own understanding of disruption is around a need to make things better somehow from the hell that we're all living through at the moment, and that some of our sisters and brothers are experiencing in such powerful, tangible and deathly ways. And the psychodrama therapist, Beverly Costa, says that you'll never change anything without humour. And that what we tend to do, because we don't in the West have the book of comedy, we have the book of tragedy as this originary narrative, we just stay in the place of repeating the despair. And so what I loved about the song, Tom, from your friends, were the boiled potatoes. And everyone just laughs when they know how awful that food is, and that the only way to stomach it is to laugh about it. That is the only place you can go to with digestion. And so I'm wondering again about Brecht and his work on satire, his work on disruption, and the powerful ways in which he articulated that in these same times at a different time that is present to us, but both historical, about the place of disruption as satire and the place of humour as where we might reach to, the ridiculing of the other that Walter Brueggemann talks about in his theologies, that actually says that is how we will change if we are able to use ridicule as power.
Thank you. Just a quick comment from me. Thank you for your point on Russia and the US. It's well made and it's well received, and I completely agree with you. Over.
Can I just respond directly to Alison?
Yeah.
Because I completely agree. And I think you talked about the construction of a common good, which reminds me a lot of a really interesting book called Narrative Poetics by Friedrich Meyer, in which he talks about the construction of a common good. But we have to always ask, whose common good, whose narratives are we referring to? So he talks about a community or a culture of any kind will have a stock of narratives, the ones that gain resonance, that gain traction. And it's really interesting to me that very often these refugee voices stories that I'm talking about get strapped to narratives of Western culture, like biblical, like the Odyssey is invoked a lot of classical tropes, Exodus as a story is invoked a lot. And by shifting the question of whose common good, whose narratives of culture are we talking about, then we can do something disruptive, and just making space for those narratives to emerge, go somewhere, to be, I wouldn't call it anarchic necessarily, but I'd say it's shifting what sense of common good we're talking about and what narratives of culture we're talking about.
Thank you so much for the questions. we are indeed engaging in detail with the ways in which religion intersects with different forms of response. But I think that the approach that we're taking is one which challenges a framework which often positions particular regions as being exceptional because they're characterised by X mode of response, and rather exploring the ways in which people respond and what they identify as motivating their response, whether it is providing assistance or not providing assistance, and what the different features are and dynamics that inspire the way that they view the world and that they respond to it. So I think part of the reason that we've brought different case studies, as it were, different geographies, different temporalities, histories, into conversation with the Refugee Host Project is to ensure that we aren't reproducing the figure or the notion of the Mediterranean or the Middle East as a hospitable region, which is often actually made a step back from recognising the politics of response and how there is a commonality of responding in solidarity and with compassion, sometimes through religion, but also at times in spite of religion or against religion. So what we're trying to do is not exceptionalise the region, to identify the commonalities that might exist, but also the differences that exist, and to ensure that when responses are hospitable, humanitarian, they are recognised as such with the political underpinnings that frame them. I think we would be very concerned around naturalising that it is inevitable that the Mediterranean or that the Middle East would be hospitable because of these ways of life, but rather interrogating and exploring how religion does play a feature in these processes, but not necessarily in the linear manner that might be assumed. In terms of the comparison, as it were, so we will be able, once we have coded and analysed all of our interview transcripts, to answer that question on what is similar or different between Lebanon and Jordan. But that's not necessarily the entry point that we have in the project. We're not aiming to compare and contrast what Hamra does in Lebanon, which is different from Badawi and different from Jebel al-Badawi's kind of camp neighbourhood, which is adjacent to camp area. We're not aiming to compare and contrast those spaces, but rather to identify the relationalities, the interconnections, the disjunctures that exist between those spaces within a given state. So Hamra, cool bars, bourgeois, coffee shops, etc., versus abject poverty and collapsing buildings in Badawi camp. They're obviously very different within the same state. So we're exploring those relationalities within countries and also across the countries, and viewing them as always being related, not being isolated spaces. So we could eventually say 57% of our respondents in X site say the same as in Y site, but I think we're going to be going a little bit beyond that, and always exploring that in relation to the context, the shifting context, obviously, within the broader framework, the broader policy framework of Lebanese politics and Jordanian politics, the position of Palestinians, Iraqis, Kurds, Armenians, the multiple groups of people who have been positioned and who have had different citizenship or naturalisation options and different politics of marginalisation and exclusion throughout. So that's effectively a bear with us, and we will have lots of analysis coming through, engaging with the interview material and the very rich participant observation, field diaries, writing workshops, etc., etc. That is the work of this year, effectively, is pulling it all together, analysing it, but probably disrupting that notion that we would be doing this research to compare and contrast across countries, across sites. I think we're trying to build that intersectional and relational frame as the mode of analysis. But brilliant question, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a good time, I think, to wrap it up there. We're going to move on to lunch. I would just like to say, obviously, 1,000 thanks to Elena and to Tom, but to Dima, who I hope is watching. Thank you for an incredibly powerful and important presentation, and we're so sorry that you can't be here, because it's just an example of how this is all working, the lack of your ability to be here.